Good evening. It's good to see you here. Monday, the week has begun, and I appreciate you taking time out of a weeknight to come out together and talk about some things relating to God's Word. And of course, Egypt. Isn't there something about Egypt that has an allure to it? It does for me. I lead overseas trips to the Bible lands and other places, but I've gone to Egypt, and Egypt brings people out like no other trip does. My next trip to Egypt is in March, and it filled up in 4 days. And there's a waiting list. And my goodness, something about Egypt. There are movies and all sorts of things. And let's move. There's a good image. The pyramids. That's the last time you'll see them tonight. They have nothing to do with the Israelites. They're not granaries. They were not built by aliens either. They were already standing there when Abraham showed up. And the road he would have taken, he would have seen the pyramids, because the highway that ran from Canaan down to Egypt ran within eyesight of the pyramids. So he would have seen them there back in his time. And of course, Joseph and anyone afterward would have seen the pyramids as well. And if we look at Jesus' family when he was a baby, Joseph and Mary, if they went far enough down, they would have seen the pyramids too. But if you read that thing a few months ago that someone had scanned them and there were some mysterious spiral structures hundreds of feet below them, and don't believe it. For one, the technology they use to scan hundreds of feet below it is not effective more than maybe 30 or 40 feet below the surface. So that's just not a thing. And some of the more sensational claims, they're usually not true. But there are some very specific things tonight we'll talk about that connect with the Bible. And of course, one of the big questions people ask initially when we talk about Egypt in the Bible is, what about the Exodus? Is there evidence of the Hebrews coming out, of the slavery, or anything related to that? And the short answer is there's not in archaeology. Not directly anyway. There's no direct evidence of it. Now, yesterday I showed you these, and some of you have seen these pictures before. Claims of chariot wheels on the bottom of the Red Sea, and that is evidence of the Exodus and the Egyptian army. Is that so? The truth is, that's not what some people claim it is, for several reasons. One, the people who found these are not archaeologists at all. They have other professions. They got into video work, and most people who make videos are not archaeologists. They're just not. And sometimes they're pretty accurate, but other times not at all. And this is one of those times when not at all. And no samples of these are ever brought up to look at. Is this really a chariot wheel? Does it match other chariot wheels from Egypt we have found? Is it the same thing, or is it something else? No one's ever brought anything up for us to test. We just get photos that are chosen for us, and this is what this is. Trust us. That's watch out for that. Especially if they're asking for money, or they're getting paid a lot of money to spread their videos, or to spread their photos, or to get speaking tours, things like that. Nothing more than guesses. And some of these things appear to be made of wood. Like one of them appears to be metal anyway. But Egyptian chariot wheels that we find, they're wooden, and wood disintegrates underwater over time, unless you have very specific conditions. Which, I'm sorry, these are not those conditions. If there's oxygen in the water, the wood's going to deteriorate. And if they're exposed like this, they're going to be exposed to oxygen. Those are not chariot wheels. There have been boats sailing on the Red Sea for thousands of years. Those could be anything, for any reason. We talk about other things in the Exodus. Well, is there other evidence somewhere? And not directly. We don't really have anything directly pointing to it. But it's not surprising either. Because if we look through ancient history, whether it's Egypt, whether it's the Babylonians, whether it's the Assyrians, whether it's the Hittites, all these ancient peoples, they did not record their failures. If you look at their records, their archives, their descriptions of battles and wars, they never say, oh, we lost. Our gods aren't as powerful as the other people's gods. They never do that. And one of the great examples is Egypt and the Hittites. At one point, they were both superpowers. And Ramses II, one of the famous pharaohs, he went up to try to expand the border. And they had a big battle up in what's now Syria. And Ramses almost lost it all and then came back and pulled out a save at the last minute. But in the end, the battle was a tie. It was a draw. Nobody won. And Ramses and the Hittite king made an agreement after all the people had died in the battle, let's just keep things the way they were before. And so they shook hands, they went home and wrote up their own versions of a peace treaty. We found both peace treaties, Hittites and Egyptians, and guess what? Both sides say, we won! So you can't trust them. Egypt is not going to record losing to an invisible slave's god. They're not going to do it. And no one did that sort of thing. So the Egyptians are going to be silent on it. And the Hebrews themselves, now what do you look for in archaeology? You look for things people build, things that survive. And the Hebrews were traveling as nomads. Tents, they pack everything up and keep going. They didn't leave anything behind. And even today, there are Bedouins, people who live that way still today. They don't leave anything behind. And when they travel, everything goes with them. You can barely tell they were even there, even just a few weeks or a few months after they've left. They're basically invisible to archaeology. So the Hebrews lived like that thousands of years ago. Do we really expect to find things left behind? We shouldn't. If we do, what luck. Other peoples are in the area, and one of the video series that's popular these days is putting Mount Sinai and the Exodus over in Saudi Arabia, and there's some good reasons not to think that's right. That's a very recent theory propagated mainly by Americans, but if you look at the Bible and everything we found, nothing ever really pointed that way until someone decided, well, let's try something different. And there are some problems with it. I mean, for every question it seems to answer, it raises another question or two that are difficult to answer. And it's not really solid. I mean, it's theoretically possible, but we're not really going to talk about those things. There's not much to talk about with the Exodus. We're going to talk about other things with Egypt, which actually show up more impressively in the Bible, in my opinion, and things that are more solid. And in fact, some of these things really, when we look at them afterwards, they might be evidence of the Hebrews being in Egypt. How so? Let's get into it and let's see what we mean by all that. The first thing we're going to talk about tonight is called the Narmer pallet. It's a piece of stone with pictures carved on it, and it's about this tall, like from the top of the podium to here. It's not that big. It has carvings on both sides. This is one side. We're just going to talk about one side tonight. Who was Narmer? He is one of the early pharaohs of Egypt. In Egypt's earlier history, it was actually two countries, and then Narmer conquered the other side and united Egypt under one king. And so that's him. And there he is. He has a tall hat. You can get a slightly different picture of him here. Zoom in a little bit. There's Narmer ruling over a newly unified Egypt. He has the tall hat on. There's one crown for Lower Egypt, like Southern Egypt, and the other side of the thing has a different crown, which is for the top part of Egypt. And so if you look at him, what's he doing? He has his hand up, has a mace. He's about to smite somebody, isn't he? There's someone down on his knees in front of him. He has the guy by the hair. He's ready to, whack him. But up in the top right corner, you see a bird, don't you? Hopefully you can see it up there. That's a falcon. And does anyone know what the name of the Egyptian falcon god is? If you're thinking Horus, you're right. Good job. That is Horus, the Egyptian falcon god. And if you look closely, if you can make it out from this distance, he's holding something. It has like a weird, almost like a burrito with a head coming off the side and some little things coming off the top. That's a lotus flower. And there's the head of an enemy king wrapped up in the lotus flower. And to us, that's a little trippy, a little weird. But back then, that made perfect sense. That's the way the Egyptian god Horus is giving you an enemy king. And the lotus flower means something, and we're not going to get into all that. But I want to point out a couple of other things. On the left side, there's a guy standing back there, much, much smaller than Pharaoh. And we might ask, what's he doing there? Because this is a piece of stone, and the artist had to make a conscious decision to make every single thing you see there. So he chose for some reason to carve that small guy back there. So what was the reason for carving him? Just to fill the space up? It's more than that. If we zoom in some more, you probably can't see it from here. He's holding something in his hand. Let's zoom in even more. There's the guy, and can you make out what that is he's holding? What does that look like to you? There's a lot of detail. I mean, look at how intricate the detail is on that. And the whole thing's just like, this big. So what's all the detail there? Those are shoes. Those are sandals. Carved very, very intricately. Tiny tools. And this is before Abraham's time when they made this. So a lot of attention goes into those shoes. Much more detail in the shoes than most other things in the picture. So why carve a guy holding shoes? It becomes more interesting when we look at Pharaoh and realize, we look at his feet, that he doesn't have any shoes on. Now this picture shows the falcon god Horus presenting an enemy king, but Narmer is barefoot. If you can look, he has no sandals on, no shoes, because they're back there. So why on earth are we showing Pharaoh barefoot, but choosing to show the guy back there holding his shoes? That's an odd detail to us. But that actually is the first example of a concept we see throughout Egyptian history. Whenever we see a pharaoh in the presence of a god, like Horus the falcon god or another one, they're always barefoot in their pictures, with one exception. But when you look at Egyptian art and the things they carved, when there's a god there and there's a pharaoh, pharaoh is always barefoot in the presence of a god. Now, why is that? And we're not really told. It's probably something like a way to show honor or respect to the god, that you take your shoes off. But does that sound familiar at all? There's a slightly closer view of barefoot pharaoh. But does that remind you of a story? And if you've read the book of Exodus, something might be coming to mind. There's a story about Moses that seems to connect with this. And we find that story in Exodus chapter 3. When Moses first sees the burning bush, he approaches it, and God is in the bush, and God's voice comes out. What's the first thing God says? Now we would think normally, what would God say? He'd introduce himself. Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And hello. That's not what he says. The first thing he says is, Moses, don't come near. Take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. That's the introduction. Does that sound a little odd? Of all the things to say first. And to our knowledge, Moses has never spoken to God before. He's heard about him, but never spoken. God's never communicated with him that we have any record of. So why would God do it this way? And why would God do that? Why would God introduce himself by saying, take off your shoes? And the text doesn't say this, but let's think for a minute. Where's Moses from? He was raised in Egypt, and he was raised connected to Pharaoh's house in some way. And later on, Stephen tells us in the book of Acts, Moses was educated in all the stuff Egyptian. So that's the Egyptian culture, right? If Moses is standing there wondering what in the world's going on, he doesn't know what the explanation is yet. A voice comes out and says, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. Instinctively, what does Moses probably associate that with? I'm in the presence of a God. See, what the Lord appears to have done is use what Moses already understood and knew. How do I get to Moses and communicate with him? And so he does it like that. He uses something Moses knows from his background. And that's the introduction. That's not a typical introduction in the Bible. In fact, do you find any other occasions when this similar thing happens? There's one other time when it happens. You remember when it is? It's Joshua. They've crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, and they're getting ready to take Jericho. And Joshua's out there somewhere near Jericho one day. We're not told where. And the commander of the army of the Lord, a guy appears there holding a sword. Joshua doesn't know who he is. He basically says, oh, friend or foe, who are you with? Which side? And the guy responds, take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. Where's Joshua from? Also raised in Egypt. Same understanding. And Joshua immediately, instinctively understands he's in the presence of the divine. And it's only Moses and Joshua that get that said to them in the Bible. No one else does. But does that make sense, though? Because who else in the Bible, if they're not raised in Egypt, would they just get that immediately? Probably not in the same way. Now, there is one exception to the shoes off in front of God rule, and that's when there's a war going on. If you're at war, then Pharaoh has his shoes on in the presence of the gods. And here's one example. This is a much later one. A guy named Ptolemy V. He was a couple hundred years before Jesus. But he was actually a Greek pharaoh, but they adopted the same thing. They called themselves pharaohs. They dressed like pharaohs. They did the whole Egyptian thing to connect with the people. And there he is looking like a pharaoh, but he was, throughout his reign, he was basically always at war with somebody. And if you look at the picture of him here in his temple, what do you notice about his feet? He's wearing sandals, but he's in the presence of a god. This is in a temple, and there's one of the Egyptian gods up there, but he has his shoes on because he's a wartime pharaoh. And so that's the exception. And we even find that in the Bible. And we talked about just now with Moses and later Joshua, take off your shoes. Those are the only two guys in the Bible who get that introduction, but both from Egypt. But there's King Tut with shoes on. But look at the Exodus. When Israel actually left Egypt, the Passover, the first Passover, they were told, eat the Passover meal with your belt on and with your sandals on your feet. Why? Because all the gods of Egypt are being judged. God is at war with Egypt's gods. And doesn't that sort of emphasize that? The Hebrews, being in Egypt, would have some cultural understandings of the Egyptians, and maybe one way to help them understand, your God is fighting for you against the gods of Egypt. Keep your shoes on. It's not just for the journey, but they would have probably connected that to the wartime issue as well. Your sandals are on when there's war, even if you're in the presence of God. So Moses and Joshua, being from Egypt, we make that connection. Do you think that might count as some sort of evidence that the Hebrews were from Egypt? They didn't do that in Babylonia or other places. This is a distinctly Egyptian thing. How did they get that in their culture? Very, very early. Maybe we don't have physical evidence of an exodus, but yet we have this, a very Egyptian trait that shows up early in the Hebrews' law, in their history. I think that may count as evidence that maybe they do have Egyptian origins after all. But there's more than that. When they came out of Egypt, and they went to Mount Sinai, and they get a law, and they had to build a tabernacle. And one of the famous things, before Indiana Jones found it in the 1930s, was the Ark of the Covenant. And they built it. It was basically a wooden box, a wooden chest. And the Hebrews covered it in gold and put some things inside related to God. And they carried it with them. And it was like the holiest thing. God's presence resided in the Ark of the Covenant. And on top they had these things called cherubim. They're these living creatures that are always associated with God whenever we see him in the Bible. But the people never looked at the ark. It was too holy. They kept it covered. They kept it in the dark. So even when you're transporting it around, they cover it with cloths. They cover it with the big veil. They'd even walk the veil forward. When they pack up the tabernacle to travel, you know how they did it? The priests wouldn't look at the ark. They'd unhook the veil and walk it forward and lay it over the Ark of the Covenant so they never had to actually see it. Then they put 2 other layers of cloth on it, I guess just to make sure people understand you don't look at God, you're separate from God. And even when the high priest went back in the most holy place, there's no light source back there. The light source is on the other side of the curtain. And they'd burn a bunch of incense first to give it all smoky and hard to see. And then the high priest would go in there through the smoke in the dark. Even the high priest really didn't get to look at the Ark of the Covenant. But there's a question about it, though, with the Ark. Kept in the dark, and no one was allowed to see it. And even the high priest, that one day a year, he didn't get a look at it. But here's a question. The Ark of the Covenant. But there's also another ark in the Bible, right? Noah's Ark. An ark and an ark, but they're very different things. So why do they have the same name? Why is that? And to add to that, when God tells them to build an ark, they seem to have understood what he was talking about. I mean, he gave detailed instructions, but there's no indication in the text that the Israelites, when they got the instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, were saying, what is this again? An ark, but not a boat? There's no trace of that. They seem to have an understanding of what it was. So what was an ark? Why do the Hebrews seem to have already known what it is, and why is Noah's boat also called an ark, even though it's not like this? And the answer, I think, part of the answer can be found by looking at Egypt. In fact, let's go to a very famous tomb. Whose tomb was discovered 100 years ago? Famous Pharaoh, King Tut, right? Yeah, everyone knows about King Tut, though ironically, almost no one knew about him in ancient times. He was so unimportant, he was forgotten. And now he's of all the ironies, he's like the one pharaoh pretty much anyone can name, the one that nobody remembered back then. Isn't history, doesn't it have a sense of irony sometimes? I'll tell you what. The things that we expect to be remembered, sometimes it goes the other way around. But in King Tut's tomb were many, many things, but including this. Does that look like anything familiar to you? Does that look like an Ark of the Covenant sort of a thing? That's because it is. Now this is just after the Hebrews would have left Egypt, and very well preserved. It looks like it was made yesterday. If you look at this, if you ever go to a King Tut traveling exhibit, this might be included. They don't always send it out. But if you go to Cairo, to the museum there, you can see it on display. But it's a wooden box. They have gold hieroglyphs inlaid all around it. There's inlaid wood and other precious ivory. And if you look carefully on the side, you can see a couple of poles sticking out, very short poles. But there are poles on both sides. And what's cool about those is those poles are retractable. You can pull them out to carry, and then when you set it down, you push them back in like you see there. So they're actually extendable. That's pretty neat. They did that back then, 3,500 years ago. And it looks brand new. But this was in King Tut's tomb. And this is roughly the same time period as the Israelites. So is there a connection? Well, there is. And King Tut's tomb also had this ark. It looks a little different. It's a little bit smaller, but we still recognize it. The poles are not extendable or retractable. They're just there. But we see it's a box covered in gold leaf. And this one has a figure of the god Anubis on the top. What were these things for? These arks in King Tut's tomb. The Egyptians used arks all the time in their temples. They were boxes or containers for sacred things, things that were sacred or considered holy. And here's another one. This is in a temple called the Temple of Edfu. That's a replica. The original's in the Louvre in Paris, where the Mona Lisa is. But that's an ark, and it has poles on it. Not the thing in the back, the thing in the front here. See the poles? And it's almost like a boat, that one is. It's like a little sailboat to put on the Nile, and it has some kind of container on the middle of the boat. This one looks like Noah's Ark, a boat, but the other ones are not boats. But they're called arks, and they all have the same purpose, whether it looks like a boat or whether it looks just like a box. An ark is a container for something holy, sacred, or precious. And if you look at what the Hebrews used their Ark of the Covenant for, the Ten Commandments are in there. Aaron's rod that budded was in there. Some manna. Things that were associated with God were placed inside. Things that were holy, that were sacred. And Noah's boat was an ark. It's carrying the highest point of creation through the flood. Isn't that sort of the same concept? Humans were created in the image of God. No, not just of this world, not just the dust of the earth, but also the breath of God. And humanity was being saved in a container carrying something holy and precious to God, the highest point of creation. So maybe that connects Noah's Ark with the Ark of the Covenant. Noah's boat was an ark, preserving something special. We come back to the Ark of the Covenant, and it matches the description. And so, where do you get the concept of an ark? Is that also evidence of the Hebrews' Egyptian origins? And maybe wonder, well, hold on a minute. I get it, and that's interesting, but is that also troublesome to you, to anyone here? Because God, these things are supposed to be from God. Are we now saying that they actually came from the Egyptians? I think it's very compatible, because look at it this way. God, when he speaks to people, does he expect them to learn his language? No. He always speaks to people in the language they understand in the Bible, whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek. He met them where they were. He spoke in terms they could understand. When he approached Moses, how did he introduce himself to Moses? Take off your sandals. Why? Because Moses understands that. When Jesus talked to people, did he talk to the crowds and with stories that they just couldn't figure out? No, he talked about things they understood, like farming, planting fields, fishing. The Lord has always met people where they were. Whether it's up here or right here or somewhere else, the Lord reaches out to us in our language in terms we can understand. A circumcision, Abraham is told to do it, but who practiced circumcision before Abraham? The Egyptians. They practiced it on some of their priests and on the royal family. When God told Abraham, I want you to circumcise the males in your family, Abraham didn't say, what's that? He knew what it was already. God's taking something people know and he redefines it for his purposes. Isn't that crucifixion? God didn't invent crucifixion just for Jesus. It was a horrible, barbaric practice other people had already invented. God took it and flipped the definition to something different. And now people wear crosses as jewelry. And you go back 2,000 years ago, no way. A cross is shameful and violent and horrifying. And now it's a symbol of hope. God redefined it. He redefined circumcision. He redefined the concept of an ark. It's not just objects associated with an Egyptian god, but God himself said he traveled in the ark with them. He used something they understood to teach them about his will. And so looking at it from that perspective, it's actually very consistent. He'd use these Egyptian things and redefine them for his purposes. And so I think it's very consistent. Let's go to a couple of other places and wrap up some other things tonight. Let's go to one of the greatest temples, the biggest temple in Egypt. It's called the Karnak Temple. And goodness, we could do several lessons on things in the Karnak Temple. We're not. We're just going to talk about a couple of things tonight. But the Karnak Temple was special because this is where every single pharaoh came to become pharaoh. The coronation. Behind the temple is the sacred lake. And they have water in it even today. They filled it up. But this is where every pharaoh would come, and they'd have a ritual by this lake, and that's how they would become pharaoh. So everyone was here at some point. Every pharaoh that was anything came to this spot. And you see the remains of the temple behind. But one feature, there are two things we're going to look at in the Karnak Temple. One is this grand entrance with like 120 columns of stone. And you may have seen pictures or videos of these things before. Every Egyptian temple had columns, but this actually had 154, not just 120. 154 of these massive stone columns, and they all were decorated with hieroglyphs, and they were painted back in the day. In a few places you can even see color, but you see the hieroglyphs all over them. And when you walk into the temple, into the sacred areas, you walk through this forest of stone columns, and you look up, and some of them have these flared tops, and some of them have closed tops. The columns represent papyrus plants. Papyrus was associated, like to make paper, the reed in the marshes. Papyrus was a symbol of one of the Egyptian gods called Ra, the sun god, the sun disk. And the ones that are open are papyrus plants that are open top, that have bloomed or blossomed. And the ones that are closed are papyrus plants that haven't yet opened. And so some columns have the closed top papyrus, some have the open top papyrus. But the whole thing's representative of the Egyptian god Ra. And some of it, can you make out the colors in the paint? Some of the original paint is still there from thousands of years ago because the desert environment just preserves it so well. But imagine going through this. And imagine if you're visiting from somewhere else and you go in here and you have 154 of these massive, colorful columns, and it's like a forest of stone columns walking through. It's designed to impress and designed to state the greatness of Egypt and its gods. There's a psychological propaganda point to this as well. Why am I talking about stone columns? Because I think they may give us some insight into something that Solomon did. What is Solomon famous for building? Temple of God. What else? His own palace. Took longer to build his palace than to build God's house. Go figure. What else did Solomon build? And maybe we were starting to think, and he built a couple, like 3 cities it mentions, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. What else did he build? One building it talks about in Jerusalem, it's not as famous, and we don't know much about it. It's called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Yeah, it was on the tip of your tongue, right? That was the next thing I was going to say, the House of the Forest of Lebanon. We're not really told much about it, except that it was around Solomon's house. It was some separate building or section of a building right next to the palace. And here's what it says in 1 Kings 7. It says Solomon was building his own house 13 years, his new palace. He finished the whole thing. And then it says he built the House of the Forest of Lebanon. And it gives the dimensions for it. And it says it's built on these rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on top of the pillars and all this cedar wood. And essentially, it's a room with these massive cedar columns. Solomon imported cedar wood to build the temple. He got it from up in Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. An exquisite imported exotic wood. It's fragrant. It's expensive. Only the best. He spared no expense, to quote Jurassic Park. But why would he build this? And why would the Bible want to point out that he built a house called the Forest of Lebanon with all these cedar columns? Are we making a connection now? If you're a powerful king, how do you show people? Well, Egypt, they're the powerful kings in the region and have been. Solomon is showing his power in relation to Egypt and, of course, the power of Israel's God. He doesn't have the square footage in Jerusalem that Egypt has. Egypt's flat. They have all this room. Jerusalem is on hills, so you have like the tops of the hills. You're restricted. What does Solomon do? He apparently is building his own version of those columns. And his aren't stone, they're cedar wood. Maybe not as huge or as tall, because cedar wood, you have to go with the size of the wood, but you walk through it and it's like and the fragrance, you smelled cedar wood, a lot of you have, it smells nice. I used to have a cedar-lined closet as a kid in a house we lived in. I didn't want to move away from that house. That was you open the door every time to your closet, you smell the cedar. Imagine walking into Solomon's, palace, and every day you walk through this massive room with these massive cedar columns and just, inhale the whole time as you go through. That's impressive. But it's taking Egypt's concept of power and royal architecture and converting it to Jerusalem. Solomon is copying Egypt, but in some ways better. It's not cold stone, it's fragrant cedar. And this picture it's guesswork. Trying to guess how his palace might have looked like and what the Forest of Lebanon. This is guesswork, but this person's guessing maybe the Forest of Lebanon house was down there, and you see all the columns shown there. And so maybe you'd walk through that before you go into Solomon's house, and so visitors get impressed. It mentions another. Now there's a closer in view, and maybe it looks something like that. 3 rows of 15 columns each, so 45 cedar columns in there. And then it mentions also a hall of pillars and a hall of the throne where he'd make pronouncements. And so this person's guessing maybe it looked like that. And maybe these columns were also cedar, but it's all designed to impress. And it echoes Egypt, but it's in Jerusalem with better materials. And so we see the influence of Egypt. And of course, Egypt is in Israel's head. Of all the princesses Solomon married from other countries, which one is singled out? Pharaoh's daughter. See, it understands Solomon's being compared to the pharaohs, and he's coming up looking good. And that's the point. So we can imagine Solomon's envoys or someone having been here and seen how this looks and go, Solomon, Here's what we need to build to show the power of God and the power of your reign and your kingdom. And so they build their own version out of cedar in Karnak. Here's another place in Karnak. We looked at this one yesterday. This not so impressive looking wall looked a lot better 3,000 years ago. But it was built by a pharaoh who invaded Canaan. Shishak, he's mentioned in the Bible. We're not going to rehash all of the same things, but I want to point out one different thing. Shishak invaded Canaan, stole a lot of money, came back and built this wall. This is his record of the invasion. And one thing that's impressive, he has dozens and dozens of these things. What's it look like? A guy holding a shield with hieroglyphs written on it. Those aren't shields. They look like shields. They're actually towns. See the bumps on the edges of the shields? Those are actually city walls, and the bumps are towers in the walls. Each one of these represents a fortified city that he either captured or that surrendered to him. And so he keeps a list. And look at all the cities I captured, that I looted, that surrendered to me, and the name of every one of them is there. Unfortunately, that Jerusalem, one section of this is damaged. It was lost. And naturally, it's the section that would have Jerusalem in it. But it has a lot of other towns and cities there. But it says in the Bible that in the 5th year of Solomon's son Rehoboam, Shishak invaded. And he went through a lot of places, this wall shows us, and came back with a lot of money, a lot of gold and silver that he plundered. And so where did Solomon's wealth go? It went to Egypt when Pharaoh was just waiting to go up there and steal it. But we talked yesterday how this wall helps us date a lot of things in the Bible. But just to rehash this briefly, in the 5th year of Rehoboam, the wall uses the Egyptian calendar, and we're able to convert that to our calendar. And so the wall shows that the invasion was about 925 BC. If that's Rehoboam's 5th year, his first year would have been 5 years earlier. So about 930, when Rehoboam began to reign, and that's when Solomon died. How long did Solomon reign again? 40 years. So do the math, go back 40 years before that, and this wall, as a fixed point, we can start doing math, and Solomon began to reign around 970. And then we keep going with that. And David reigned 40 years, split between a couple of different places. And when we put the numbers in there and do the math, he began reigning over Judah in the city of Hebron about 1010 BC. And in Jerusalem, he captured it and made it his new capital around 1003 BC. And the Bible also gives us other numbers, like when Solomon began building the temple in his 4th year. So if Solomon began in 970, his 4th year would have been about 966 when he started building the temple. It also connects that to 480 years after the Exodus. So we can use math and get an Exodus date, if those numbers are literal, about 1446 BC. From one wall in the city of Karnak, we can get all that. And it gives us fixed points in the Bible for some of the most important people in the Bible, especially David. And very, very beneficial. But it also confirms the invasion. And so several benefits there. Let's go to a nearby temple, a temple called Luxor. In the Bible, it was called Thebes. And you take this picture of the front, but you turn around and look the other way, and they have a replica of the ark that used to be in that temple. Because Egyptian temples had a Holy of Holies. And they had their ark in the Holy of Holies. And this one looks like a boat also. That's a replica, a copy of the one that used to be there, which was carried off somewhere else. But there in that, it would have had some sacred objects associated with the god of that temple. There's an Egyptian concept. But one interesting thing about this, you walk inside, and there are a lot of columns, not as many as Karnak, but there's an open courtyard. But temples were also universities. The nobles and the royal family members, the kids, got their education in the temples. And the temples served as schools and as hospitals. This temple in Luxor, in Thebes, guess what the capital of Egypt was in the time of Moses? Thebes. It was the capital. And so Moses, if he received an Egyptian education, where would that have happened? In this building, in this courtyard. This is where Moses apparently went to school and learned everything about Egyptian culture and history and learned to read and write and everything else. And it's a great tour at nighttime, but look at those columns. And this view shows from the outside looking in. And this is the pathway. If Moses were here, he would have walked straight down through here to go inside the areas of the temple where he would have gotten his education and where a royal family would have been permitted, but not the regular people. So Moses was here, apparently. It makes sense. And here's there's another view of those columns on the left side. That's the walkway inside the temple between those columns. And so he would have walked around this area, the courtyard there, and we can go there. You can go there with me and get your picture where Moses used to walk, where he went to school. And you even bring a couple kids along if you can afford it. Those are my two youngest sons. That was this past March, just a few months ago. Noah, the taller one, and Samuel, the younger one. They were 12 and 10 in the photo. But it's a great education, and homeschool, extra flexibility, right? But anyone can go. But you can go and walk where Moses walked and walk yourself through that very specific walkway where Moses and Egyptian priests and others would have walked in that time. Okay, well, that'll do it for tonight. We could delve more deeply into Egypt, but we see that Egypt, we don't need to look for the Exodus or that particular kind of story to get benefits on understanding the Bible. In fact, some of the things we've looked at show evidence of the Hebrews having been there. Where else would they have learned about arcs and those kinds of concepts? God took what they knew and used that to teach them His will and His law, and to teach them about Himself. And so we can see Egyptian influence in the Bible, and we can understand it when we look at the archaeology of Egypt and see the roots there that were shared by Egypt and the Israelites. Because the Israelites had a lot of history. Abraham was in Egypt. Joseph was in Egypt. Jacob was in Egypt. Jacob's descendants grew up, and the Hebrew nation, the Israelite nation, formed in Egypt. It should not surprise us. In fact, we should even expect to see a lot of Egypt in their culture and in the way they looked at the world. And we do. Well, let's go ahead and wrap things up with an invitation. Because one lesson from the Exodus and one lesson from the law that Moses gave to Israel from God is that God is supreme. Whatever we think is powerful and great and mighty on earth, whether it's back then Egyptian gods, or maybe today governments or military might or economic power, or whatever it is that we tend to hold up as a powerful influence, we have plenty of reminders in the Bible that God is easily superior to everything else, to anything else. And He can use anyone to serve His will. God could use the Egyptians to accomplish His will without them even knowing that that's what He was doing. They didn't even believe in God, and God used them and showed them the truth about their false beliefs. And it says a mixed multitude went with the Israelites out of Egypt. May have included some Egyptians. In fact, one of Moses' companions early after the Exodus, his name was Hur, H-U-R. Maybe you remember that name. The story when there's a battle and they're holding up Moses' arms and they're winning when his arms are up and lose when they're down. Two guys held up his arms. One of them was Hur, or Hur. You know who Hur is? That's the same name as the Egyptian god Horus. One of Moses' companions was named for the Egyptian falcon god Horus, Hur, or Hur in the Bible. So Egyptian names among the Israelites. We shouldn't be surprised. But God is still supreme today. And anything that you think governs your life or that you want to give your life to, or even yourself, God is superior. He always has been. And it's good and wise to be humble before God. And if you need to put Him on tonight, to acknowledge Him as your Lord and King, to humble yourself before Him, to take these lessons to heart that have been there the whole time for us, do that now. Let's all stand together and sing the song that Levi announced.